They buried my older brother, Jacob, today. The town sent flowers, peonies and white roses, I imagine, the kind of tasteful, expensive arrangements reserved for men of his standing. They would have called him a pillar of the community, a testament to Havenwood's pioneering spirit. The obituary in the local paper, which I read online with a sense of clinical detachment, used words like titan, patriarch, and visionary. I'm sure the eulogies were just as grand. I didn't go to the funeral. From the window of my small, quiet apartment, the sky over Colorado is a vast, indifferent blue. It's the same sky that stretches over the Havenwood Cemetery, over the plot of earth my family has owned for generations, the same sky that watched everything and said nothing. I didn't need to be there to see it. I could picture my eldest brother, Michael, his face a mask of solemn dignity, accepting condolences with the practiced grace that had defined his entire life. I could hear the hushed whispers of the townspeople, recalling Jacob's athletic prowess in his youth, his business acumen in his prime, his supposed generosity in his twilight years. They would speak of the Albright legacy, a name carved into the very foundations of this town, solid and respectable as granite. But granite can be ground to dust. Instead of dressing in black, I wore my favorite gray cardigan and went to my lawyer's office. The air in Sarah Chen's office smells of clean paper and determination. It's a scent I've come to associate with freedom. She had the documents ready, a neat, formidable stack on her polished mahogany desk. The final papers. I picked up the pen, its weight cool and substantial in my 75-year-old hand, a hand mapped with the fine lines of a long and quiet life. As I signed my name, Emma Albright, a name I once felt was a brand on my skin, on the last page, I didn't feel sorrow or even triumph. I felt a quiet click, like a lock, rusted shut for 60 years, finally giving way. With each stroke of ink, I was not just transferring assets or dissolving trusts, I was erasing a legacy. I was methodically, legally, and irrevocably dismantling the House of Albright from the inside out. They think my story began with Jacob's death, a final, sad chapter in a lonely spinster's life. They are wrong. It began 60 years ago, in a hallway that was always too dark, in a house that was always too quiet. It began with the slow, creeping realization that monsters don't always live in the shadows. Sometimes they are the ones who cast them. To understand the end, you must see the beginning. You must see the house as I saw it. Our house stood on Elm Street, a grand Victorian with a sprawling porch and windows that glittered like judgmental eyes. It was a source of pride for my parents, Richard and Carol Albright, a symbol of their unassailable position in Havenwood society. The floors were polished to a mirror shine. The air was thick with the scent of my mother's lavender potpourri and my father's pipe tobacco, a fragrance of domestic tranquility that was a consummately crafted lie. Every object had its place. Every person had their role. It was a museum of a perfect family, and we were the exhibits. My father, Richard, was a man of formidable presence and few words. He was the town's most successful attorney, a man whose opinion carried the weight of scripture. His love was a distant, conditional thing, a reward to be earned. It was bestowed in the form of a gruff nod of approval or a rare, satisfied smile. He was the sun around which our small family solar system was meant to orbit, but his warmth was reserved for his sons. My mother, Carol, was the meticulous curator of our family's image. Her life was a series of carefully managed appearances, garden club meetings, charity luncheons, Sunday services where she ensured her family sat in the front pew, a portrait of devotion and prosperity. Her approval was measured in the crispness of a shirt collar, the shine on a pair of shoes, the absence of any emotional display that might suggest imperfection. She saw her children not as individuals, but as reflections of her success. And then there were my brothers. Michael, the eldest, was the golden boy, the prodigy. He was destined for greatness, a fact repeated so often it became an unassailable truth. His world was one of books, debate trophies, and the quiet, intense pressure of my father's expectations. He moved through the house with a serene confidence, his mind already dwelling in the Ivy League halls that awaited him. My parents would watch him, their faces glowing with a pride so profound it was almost worshipful. Michael was their legacy, their proof of a superior lineage. He was quiet, studious, and possessed a preternatural understanding of the family's unspoken rules. He knew, better than anyone, the importance of maintaining the facade. Jacob was the star. If Michael was the family's intellect, Jacob was its charisma. He was 2 years my senior, blessed with our father's height and a smile that could disarm armies. He was the captain of the football team, the boy every girl wanted, the son every father wished they had. Where Michael earned praise through diligence, Jacob commanded it through sheer force of personality. He moved with an easy, predatory grace, his laughter echoing through our quiet halls, a sound our parents cherished. When he broke a vase playing ball in the house, my father would chuckle and say, "That's my boy, full of life." When he stayed out past curfew, my mother would simply sigh and say, "He's popular, what can I do?" They saw his recklessness as charm, his arrogance as confidence. In their eyes, Jacob could do no wrong. He was the Sun King, and the rest of us were just planets caught in his orbit. And me? I was Emma, the daughter. The afterthought. My world was the quiet corner of the living room with my sketchbook, the dusty shelves of the library, the attic window where I could watch the world without having to be in it. I was a creature of silence in a house that demanded it. My artistic talents were seen not as a gift, but as a quaint, girlish hobby. A drawing I spent hours on would receive a cursory, "That's nice, dear," from my mother before her attention invariably drifted back to one of her sons. My father rarely spoke to me at all, his gaze seeming to pass right through me as if I were made of glass. I remember one dinner, the air heavy with the scent of roast chicken. The light from the chandelier overhead caught the crystal glasses, splintering into 1,000 tiny rainbows. My father was holding court, recounting a legal victory. Michael was interjecting with intelligent questions, earning pleased nods. Jacob was telling a story from football practice, his voice booming, making our parents laugh. I sat there, a ghost at the feast, watching them. I had won a blue ribbon at the county fair for a watercolor painting that day. The ribbon was upstairs, tucked away in my drawer. I opened my mouth to share my news, the words forming on my tongue, but the wall of their shared world was impenetrable. The moment passed, swallowed by the sound of Jacob's laughter. It was then I understood. I was not a participant in this family. I was a spectator. My role was to be quiet, to be good, and most importantly, to be invisible. I was the sparrow in a cage of eagles, and my only defense was to make no sound, to draw no attention, to simply exist without truly living. That silence, I thought, would keep me safe. It was a child's logic, and it was the most dangerous mistake of my life. That silence, I learned, wasn't a shield. It was an invitation. In a house built on unspoken rules, the most important rule was that my comfort, my space, my very self, was secondary to the placid surface of our family life. And Jacob, with an animal instinct for weakness, understood this better than anyone. He was the golden son, the celebrated prince of Havenwood, and the territory he was beginning to claim was me. It didn't start with a thunderclap. It began as a slow change in the climate of the house, a pressure drop that only I could feel. The hallways, once just passages between rooms, became gauntlets. I'd be walking to the kitchen, and he would suddenly be there, emerging from a doorway, forcing me to press myself against the wall to let him pass. He would do it with a smile, a casual, "Excuse me, Em," that made my stomach tighten, because we both knew the hallway was wide enough for a carriage. It was a subtle assertion of dominance, a reminder that he controlled the space we moved in. His presence began to feel like a stain, seeping into the corners of my life I had once considered safe. I'd be reading in the armchair in the living room, lost in another world, and a prickling on my neck would tell me he was there before I ever saw him. I would look up to find him leaning in the doorway, not looking at a book or a magazine, just watching me, a faint, unreadable smile on his lips. If I met his gaze, he wouldn't look away. He would hold it, a silent challenge, until I was the one who had to drop my eyes back to the page, the words now just a meaningless jumble. My sanctuary was breached. At the dinner table, his campaign grew bolder. He would ask me to pass the salt, and as I handed it to him, his fingers would brush against mine and linger for a fraction of a second too long. It was nothing anyone else would ever notice. My father wouldn't look up from his plate. My mother would be focused on whether Michael had enough gravy. Michael would be lost in his own thoughts. But I would feel it, a touch that was not accidental, a jolt of something proprietary and wrong. One evening, while reaching for the breadbasket behind my chair, he rested his hand on my shoulder. It was heavy, hot, a dead weight that seemed to pin me to my seat. I flinched, a small, involuntary movement. He squeezed, just once, a gesture that could have been mistaken for brotherly affection. But his eyes, which I saw reflected in the polished sideboard, held a glint of cruel amusement. He knew exactly what he was doing. The nights became the worst. Our bedrooms were on the second floor, separated by the long, dark hallway that my younger self had always feared. Now that fear had a name. I would lie in bed, my ears straining against the quiet, listening for the creak of his floorboards. Sometimes he would stand in his open doorway as I walked past from the bathroom, a looming silhouette against the dim light. "Sleep well, little sister," he'd murmur, his voice a low rumble that was meant to sound soothing but felt like a threat. The words were kind. The intention was poison. I would scurry into my room, my heart hammering against my ribs, feeling his eyes on my back until the door was shut. But a shut door was no longer a comfort. The final violation of my dwindling peace came one Saturday afternoon. I was in my room, changing out of my school clothes. The door was closed. I had a sense of privacy that was, I realized later, entirely illusory. Without a knock, the door swung open. Jacob stood there, leaning against the doorframe, one arm casually braced above his head. He took in the scene, me, frozen mid-motion, clutching my blouse to my chest, and a slow smirk spread across his face. He didn't fluster or immediately apologize. He let the moment hang in the air, thick and suffocating. "Oops," he said, his voice lazy. "Thought you were downstairs." "Get out," I whispered, the words barely audible. "Relax, Em," he said, not moving. "It's not like I haven't seen it all before. We used to take baths together, remember?" He was referencing a shared childhood that felt a million miles away, using it to cheapen my shock, to make me feel foolish for my own sense of violation. He finally pushed himself off the doorframe and left, pulling the door closed behind him, but the damage was done. He had shown me that not even the space behind my own bedroom door was truly mine. That was the breaking point. The constant low-grade terror had coalesced into a hard knot of desperation in my chest. I had to tell someone. I had to. I found my mother in the sunroom, carefully snipping the dead leaves from her prize-winning geraniums. The room was bright, warm, and orderly, a perfect reflection of the world she fought so hard to maintain. She looked up as I entered, her smile tight and distracted. "What is it, Emma? You're hovering." My throat was dry. I twisted the hem of my skirt in my hands. It's about Jacob." Her focus sharpened slightly, but not with concern. It was with a kind of wary annoyance, the look of a person anticipating a problem that would disrupt her peace. "What about Jacob?" He keeps bothering me," I stammered, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. How could I explain the dread his presence inspired? "He comes into my room without knocking. He looks at me." My mother set her shears down with a delicate click. She sighed, a sound of profound weariness, as if I had just presented her with the most tedious problem imaginable. "Emma, for heaven's sake, you have such a flair for the dramatic." "Jacob is your brother. He loves you." "No, it's not like that," I insisted, my voice rising with a panic she immediately misinterpreted as hysteria. "The way he looks at me, the things he does." "You're being overly sensitive," she cut me off, her tone becoming crisp and final. "Your brother is a popular, healthy young man. He's probably just trying to be friendly, and you, with your head always in a book, don't know how to take a little teasing. I will not have you making trouble for him." "Do you have any idea the pressure he is under, the expectations? The last thing he needs is his own sister making up stories and causing strife in this house. Now pull yourself together. This conversation is over." She turned back to her geraniums, her posture communicating a dismissal more absolute than any spoken words. I stood there for a moment, invisible again, the bright sun of the room feeling cold on my skin. I had appealed to the highest court in my world and had been summarily rejected. There were no other allies. There was nowhere else to turn. Defeated, I retreated to my room, the one place that now offered no refuge at all. I sat on the edge of my bed, the floral comforter suddenly feeling childish and flimsy. The silence of the house pressed in on me. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps in the hall. They stopped outside my door. My head snapped up. The doorknob turned. Jacob stepped inside, closing the door quietly behind him. He didn't say a word. He just looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw a chilling certainty. He knew I had told our mother, and he knew she had done nothing. This was his victory lap. His gaze moved from my face to the small brass lock on the inside of the door. He walked over to it, his movements unhurried, deliberate. And then I heard it, a sound that would echo in my memory for the rest of my life. The sharp, definitive click of the lock turning. My breath hitched in my throat. My entire body went rigid. This was different. This was not a casual violation or a lingering touch. This was a declaration. He hadn't just closed the door. He had sealed it. He had sealed me in with him. He didn't move towards me. He didn't have to. The terror was a living thing in the room, and he was feeding on it. He walked over to my desk, picked up my sketchbook, and began to flip through the pages, his expression one of mild, condescending interest. My drawings of trees, of birds, of my own hands, they felt naked under his gaze. He stopped at a charcoal portrait I had been working on, a self-portrait. He held it up, a small, cruel smile playing on his lips. "You never get the eyes right, do you?" he said, his voice soft. "You always make them look so scared." He set the sketchbook down and ambled over to my dressing table, picking up a small porcelain ballerina, a gift from my grandmother. He tossed it lightly from one hand to the other. My heart pounded with every arc it made in the air. I was terrified he would drop it, terrified he would crush it in his fist. He was showing me, with agonizing slowness, that everything I considered mine was his, to touch, to inspect, to break, and then I heard it. Footsteps in the hall, heavier than Jacob's, slower. Michael. A surge of desperate, irrational hope shot through me. He was coming back from the library. He would hear that Jacob was in here. He would know the door was locked. He would knock. He would say something. He would save me. I made a sound, a tiny strangled whimper. I didn't even realize I'd done it until I saw Jacob's smile widen. The footsteps outside paused. For one long, agonizing second, the world held its breath. I could feel Michael's presence on the other side of the wood, a tangible thing. "Please," I begged silently. "Please, Michael, do something." The floorboards outside the door creaked once. And then the footsteps resumed, continuing down the hall, their rhythm steady, unfaltering, until they faded away towards his own room. The silence that descended in the wake of his departure was more profound than any I had ever known. The last ember of hope inside me died, leaving behind a cold, hard ash. Jacob hadn't just locked me in this room. Michael had just bolted it from the outside. My tormentor and his accomplice had declared, without a single word, that I was utterly, completely alone. Jacob set the ballerina down, his show complete. He walked back to the door, his movements still unhurried, and with another soft click, he unlocked it and left, leaving me in a silence that was no longer empty, but filled with the certainty of what was to come. That single, final click of the lock opening did not set me free. It was the sound of a cage door being left ajar by a zookeeper who wanted to see what the animal would do. The days that followed were lived in a state of suspended dread. The unspoken threat was now the loudest thing in the house. Jacob's power over me was absolute, and he knew it. He no longer needed to perform his subtle acts of intimidation. The memory of the locked door was enough. A glance across the dinner table, a smirk as we passed in the hall. These were enough to make my blood run cold. He was toying with me, savoring his control, and I felt myself shrinking, becoming smaller and quieter, hoping that if I made myself insignificant enough, he might lose interest. My world contracted to the dimensions of my bedroom. I ate my meals quickly, my eyes on my plate, and fled upstairs. I gave up my quiet corners of the house, abandoning the living room armchair and the attic window. The entire house felt contaminated by his presence. I moved through it like a spy in enemy territory, my ears perpetually tuned to the sound of his footsteps, my body braced for a confrontation that felt both terrifying and inevitable. The life of the family churned on around me, a pageant of normalcy that only amplified my isolation. My parents' willful blindness was a wall I could not scale, and Michael's silent complicity was a chasm at my feet. There was no escape. The storm came on a Tuesday night in late October. My parents were at a fundraising dinner for the mayor, a civic duty my mother took as seriously as scripture. The wind howled around the corners of the house, rattling the window panes like skeletal fingers, and rain lashed against the glass in furious sheets. It was the kind of night that made the world outside feel distant and unreal, and the world inside feel intensely, claustrophobically close. Michael was where he always was, secluded in his room at the far end of the hall, the faint glow from under his door a sign that he was communing with his books, insulated from the storm both outside and within our walls. I had waited until I was sure Jacob was in his room before creeping downstairs for a glass of water. The great-grandfather clock in the foyer ticked with a slow, ponderous finality, each tick a heartbeat in the cavernous silence. The kitchen was dark, save for the weak moonlight that filtered through the window above the sink, casting long, distorted shadows across the checkered floor. I filled my glass, the sound of the running water unnaturally loud. My only thought was to get back to my room, back behind my door, which I now wedged shut with a chair every night, a futile gesture that gave me a sliver of imagined security. I turned from the sink, and he was there. He had made no sound. He was simply filling the doorway, blocking my only exit. The storm outside seemed to fade to a dull roar, all the sound in the world collapsing into the space between us. He smelled of the damp night air and something else, something cloyingly familiar. It was our father's cologne, the expensive kind he wore for important events. It was a scent I had always associated with untouchable authority, with the safety of a father's presence. Now it was twisted into the smell of my own violation, a scent I would gag on for the rest of my life. "Scared of the storm, Em?" he asked, his voice a low mockery. I didn't answer. I stood frozen, the cold glass slick in my hand, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. He took a step into the room, and another. The weak light caught the planes of his face, his handsome features made sinister by the shadows. I backed away until the edge of the kitchen counter pressed into my spine. There was nowhere else to go. What happened next is a memory that exists outside of time. It lives in my body, not as a linear story, but as a collection of poisoned senses. There was the rough texture of his jacket against my cheek, the terrifying strength in his hands, the way my voice simply died in my throat, a scream with no sound. My spirit seemed to float up to the ceiling, a terrified spectator watching a scene of unspeakable violence unfold below. I watched as he pushed me down, as my head hit the unforgiving linoleum. I remember the coldness of the floorboards seeping through the thin cotton of my nightgown, a deep, invasive chill that seemed to reach my very bones. I remember the grandfather clock beginning to chime 10, each bong a death knell, marking a moment when my life cleaved in two, the girl I was before and the ghost I became after. I was a doll in his hands, a thing to be used and discarded, utterly, completely powerless. When it was over, the silence he left behind was a physical presence. It was heavier than the storm, louder than the ticking clock. He stood up, adjusted his clothes with a casual, dismissive gesture, and walked out of the kitchen without a backward glance. I lay on the floor, a broken thing amidst the shadows, listening to his footsteps recede up the stairs. The world had returned to my body, and with it came the pain, a deep, shuddering agony that was more than just physical. It was the agony of a soul that had been ripped apart. I don't know how long I remained there. Time had ceased to have meaning, but eventually, a single primal instinct cut through the fog of shock. I could not stay here. I could not let this be the end. Pushing myself up was the hardest thing I had ever done. Every muscle screamed, every part of me felt bruised and defiled. I stumbled through the house, my own home now as alien as a foreign country. My parents' smiling portraits on the wall seemed to mock me. The polished furniture, the tasteful decorations, they were all part of a lie so profound it felt like madness. My mind, shattered as it was, latched onto a single desperate thought. Michael. My parents had failed me. Jacob was a monster. But Michael was the golden boy, the intelligent one, the one with a supposed conscience. He was my only hope. I made my way to the library, the family's inner sanctum, Michael's sacred space. The door was closed. I pushed it open, my hand trembling. He was there, just as I knew he would be. He sat at the great mahogany desk, bathed in the warm, green-tinted glow of the banker's lamp. He was surrounded by towering shelves of leather-bound books, symbols of order, reason, and civilization. He looked up, his expression one of mild annoyance at the interruption. And then he saw me. His face changed. The annoyance vanished, replaced by a flicker of confusion, then alarm. I must have been a horrifying sight, my hair wild, my nightgown torn, my eyes wide with a terror that was beyond tears. I stood there, unable to speak, shaking uncontrollably. "Emma?" he said, his voice sharp with a concern I had never heard from him before. "What is it? What happened?" The sound of my name, spoken with genuine alarm, broke the dam. A terrible, ragged sob tore from my throat. The words came out in a torrent, broken and nonsensical. "Jacob, downstairs. He hurt me. I couldn't finish. I couldn't give the act its name." I choked on the word, my body convulsing with the effort of holding myself together. Michael was out of his chair in an instant. He moved quickly, shutting the heavy library doors, enclosing us in a cocoon of silence. He came to me, and for the first time since we were small children, he put his arms around me. I collapsed against him, all the strength draining from my limbs. He held me as I wept, his hand stroking my hair in a gesture of awkward, unpracticed comfort. "It's okay," he murmured, his voice close to my ear. "It's okay, Emma. I'm here now." "Tell me what happened." Through my sobs, I told him. I whispered the fragmented, ugly truth against the starched fabric of his shirt. I told him about the kitchen, about the cologne, about the cold floor. When I was done, a spent and shuddering silence filled the room. I waited for him to pull away, to call me a liar, to tell me I was being dramatic, just like our mother had. But he didn't. He held me tighter. I could feel the tension in his body, a coiled spring of rage and shock. He pulled back just enough to look at my face, his own pale and grim in the lamplight. "I believe you," he said, his voice low and fierce. The words were a balm on a gaping wound. They were everything. "I'll handle Jacob," he continued, his eyes hardening with a resolve I had never seen in him. "I promise you, Emma, I'll make it stop. He will never, ever touch you again." He led me to the leather armchair by the cold fireplace and made me sit, wrapping an old woolen blanket around my shoulders. He stood before me, my older brother, my protector, his face set with a righteous fury that was, for that one night, entirely on my behalf. A fragile, impossible hope began to bloom in the barren wasteland of my heart. I was not alone. I had an ally. The world was not entirely lost. It was the most potent lie I was ever told, because it was the one I most desperately needed to believe. That single, shimmering promise was the hook on which he would hang my life. And for one night, as the storm raged outside, I mistook it for a star. I clung to it, letting its false light lead me out of the darkness, unaware that it was guiding me into a deeper, more permanent night. The fragile peace that followed that night was a strange and brittle thing. Michael, true to his word, became my shadow, my keeper. In the days and weeks that followed, he erected an invisible wall around me. At the dinner table, he would invariably take the seat between me and Jacob. If he saw Jacob walking down the hall toward me, he would suddenly need to ask me a question about a book, steering me away into the library. He never spoke of what I had told him, and I never brought it up. It was a dark jewel we kept locked away, its existence acknowledged only by the grim set of his jaw whenever he looked at our other brother. I had not been freed. I had simply been transferred from one brother's custody to another's. Jacob, for his part, retreated into a sullen, resentful silence. The charming prince was gone, replaced by a brooding predator who had been temporarily leashed. His power had been checked, not by our parents, but by the one person whose opinion seemed to matter in our twisted family hierarchy. He complied, but his eyes followed me with a new kind of hatred. It was the fury of a king whose divine right had been challenged. He no longer smiled his cruel smile at me. He simply stared, his gaze a promise that this truce was temporary, that his patience had its limits. The house was quiet, but it was the strained, breathless quiet of a battlefield between skirmishes. I lived on a knife's edge, my sense of safety entirely dependent on Michael's vigilance, a debt I felt growing heavier with each passing day. Then, my body, the last sovereign territory I possessed, began to betray me. It started subtly, a profound weariness that settled deep in my bones, a fatigue that sleep could not cure. I blamed it on the stress, the constant humming anxiety of living under the same roof as my attacker. Then came the strange aversions. The smell of my mother's morning coffee, a scent I had always loved, suddenly made my stomach churn. The roast beef she made every Sunday, a family tradition, was now repulsive. I would push the food around on my plate, pleading a headache, my appetite having vanished completely. My mother noticed, of course. "You're looking peaked, Emma," she'd say, her brow furrowed not with sympathy, but with annoyance at this disruption to the family's placid routine. A young girl should have some color in her cheeks, perhaps a tonic is in order. I would murmur my assent, praying she would drop the subject, terrified of any focused attention. And then the sickness began in earnest. It arrived each morning with punctual cruelty. I would wake up feeling fine, and then, as the house began to stir, a wave of violent nausea would roll through me, sending me rushing to the bathroom at the end of the hall. I would kneel on the cold tile floor, my body convulsing, emptying itself of nothing. I would run the taps full blast, hoping the sound of the water would cover the wretched, heaving sounds, my forehead pressed against the cool porcelain of the basin. I would emerge minutes later, pale and trembling, my reflection in the mirror a stranger's, her eyes wide with a fear I didn't yet understand. For 2 weeks, I told myself it was the flu, a lingering sickness born of trauma. I clung to that explanation because the alternative was too monstrous to contemplate. I became an expert in subterfuge, a ghost who haunted the edges of family life. I would wake before anyone else to get my sickness over with, in private. I perfected the art of appearing to eat, of feigning interest in conversations while my entire being was focused on the simple, monumental task of not being sick in front of my family. The calendar in my room hung by my desk, a simple thing with pictures of American birds for each month. I had always been diligent about marking it. One evening, as the nausea from the morning finally subsided into a dull ache, my eyes fell upon it. A small, neat X marked the day my monthly cycle was due. That day had passed a week ago. I traced the empty boxes that followed it, my finger trembling slightly. The fatigue, the sickness, the aversion to coffee, the date on the calendar. They were not separate symptoms, they were a constellation, and they were pointing to a single horrifying truth. I sank onto my bed, the room seeming to tilt around me. It couldn't be. It was impossible. A desperate, frantic denial rose in my throat. But my own body was an undeniable witness. The memory of that night on the cold kitchen floor, a memory I had tried to bury, to burn, to obliterate, rose up with terrifying clarity. It hadn't been buried at all. It had taken root. The realization did not come with a scream. It was a slow, seeping cold that started in my stomach and spread through my veins until I felt encased in ice. My hand, moving of its own accord, drifted to my belly. It felt the same as it always had, flat and unassuming. But it was a lie. Inside me, a secret was growing. A living, breathing testament to my own defilement. There is no word in the English language for the specific horror of this. It is a unique form of violation that language has not yet caught up to. To have the evidence of your own destruction flourishing inside you, to feel your body, the one thing that is supposed to be your own, become a collaborator in your own ruin. It was a monstrous paradox. My body was nurturing the very thing that had shattered my soul. I was not just a victim. I had become the living vessel of the crime itself. This was not a child. It was a parasite, a sickness with no name, a tumor of memory given flesh. From that moment on, my life became a frantic, silent effort to conceal a truth that was growing more real every day. The world was no longer a place of potential, but a landscape of threats. Every interaction was a tightrope walk over a chasm of discovery. My fear of my parents became a physical thing, an ache in my chest. I imagined telling my mother. I could see her face, the initial confusion turning to disgust, then to a cold, hard fury. She would not see me, her daughter who had been hurt. She would see a scandal, a blemish on her perfect family, a source of unspeakable shame. She would blame me for being careless, for being provocative, for bringing this disgrace upon her house. Her love was conditional on my perfection, and I was now the most imperfect thing imaginable. My father's reaction would be worse. His silence, which had governed my life, would finally break, and I knew it would be with a roar of righteous anger. He, a man of the law, would see me as a criminal, the carrier of a sin that had tainted his good name. He would not ask who had done it. He would not care. The only fact that would matter was the one blooming in my womb. I was the source of the problem. I was the stain to be removed, and Jacob, a new, more complex terror infused my thoughts of him. Before, I feared his physical presence, his fists, his cruel words. Now, I feared what he would do if he knew. Would he be pleased? Would he see this as the ultimate brand of ownership, a final, undeniable mark of his conquest? Or would the threat of exposure turn him violent in a new, more final way? Every time he looked at me now, I felt a hot flush of shame, a certainty that he could see right through me, that his predator's instinct knew the consequence of his actions. I would lower my eyes, my heart pounding, praying he would see nothing but the same quiet, timid sister he had always known. But the most agonizing fear was reserved for Michael, my savior. My protector, the one person who had looked at me with kindness, who had promised to keep me safe. How could I go to him with this? This truth was too grotesque, too vile. It was a secret that felt radioactive, capable of poisoning everything it touched. To tell him would be to admit that his protection had failed in the most catastrophic way imaginable. I feared that the sheer ugliness of it would shatter his compassion, that he would look at me with the same disgust as our parents. This secret, this sickness, was so monstrous that it isolated me even from my only ally. I spent my nights awake, one hand resting on my stomach, feeling the alien presence there. The promise of a brother had saved me from his fists, but it could not save me from his blood. I was trapped, not just in this house, not just in this town, but in the prison of my own skin. And a new fear, colder and sharper than any I had known before, began to take root in the desolate quiet of my soul. The fear of what would have to be done. The fear of what would have to be done was a constant metallic taste in my mouth. For weeks, I lived in a state of suspended animation, my secret a fragile, swelling sphere inside me. Every morning brought the same sickness, every day the same exhausting performance of normalcy. The chair wedged under my doorknob at night felt increasingly flimsy, a child's defense against a danger that was already inside the gates. Time, which had once felt infinite, was now my enemy. My own body was a clock ticking down to a moment of inevitable discovery. The decision to tell Michael was not born of courage, but of sheer animal panic. My clothes were beginning to strain at the seams. I caught my mother looking at me one afternoon with a strange, narrowed gaze, her eyes lingering on my waistline. The unspoken question hung in the air, and I knew I was days, perhaps hours, away from an interrogation I could not survive. Telling Michael felt like stepping off a cliff, but the ground I stood on was already crumbling into the sea. I had to believe that the brother who had promised to protect my body would also protect me from its consequences. I had to believe in the memory of his fierce eyes and his gentle hands. It was the only hope I had left. I chose the library again. It felt like a grim piece of symmetry, returning to the scene of his original promise. I waited for him after dinner, the book I was pretending to read a heavy, meaningless weight in my lap. The room was quiet, filled with the scent of old paper and dust, the ghosts of 1,000 stories that were not my own. When he finally entered, a book in hand, he seemed surprised to find me there. "Emma," he said, his voice holding a note of caution. In the week since the truce, our interactions had been brief and functional. We did not speak of the darkness. We simply managed it. "You're up late." "I needed to talk to you," I said, my voice thin. He sighed, a barely audible sound of impatience. and closed the heavy doors. He leaned against the desk, crossing his arms, adopting the posture of a man ready to solve a problem. "Is it Jacob? Did he do something?" "No," I whispered, shaking my head. It's not that." I stood up, my legs feeling unsteady. I couldn't look at him. I fixed my gaze on a portrait of our grandfather, his stern face seeming to judge me from across the century. "It's about that night," I began, the words tasting like ash. "The promise you made. You kept me safe." "But there's a consequence," I faltered, the clinical word hanging in the air between us. He was silent, waiting. His silence was not patient, it was demanding. "Michael, I finally forced myself to look at him. I'm pregnant." The words fell into the quiet room and landed with no sound, yet they seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. I watched his face, searching desperately for the compassionate brother I remembered from that other night. I saw confusion first, then a flicker of disbelief. But as he looked at me, at my pale face, at the way my hand unconsciously went to my stomach, the disbelief hardened into something else. It was not shock. It was not sympathy. It was cold, pure, undiluted panic. And in that panic, I saw the first glimpse of the stranger he truly was. He pushed himself off the desk and began to pace, his footsteps sharp and angry on the antique rug. He didn't look at me. He looked at the walls, the ceiling, as if calculating the dimensions of a disaster. "No," he said more to himself than to me. "No, that's not possible." He stopped and finally turned on me, his eyes narrowed. "Are you sure?" "Yes," I whispered. He resumed his pacing, running a hand through his perfectly combed hair, messing it up for the first time I could ever remember. "A baby," he muttered, the words sounding like a curse. "My God, Emma, do you have any idea what this means?" He started talking, his voice low and rapid, a torrent of self-preservation. "A scandal like this, it would destroy us. It would destroy everything." He gestured around the room at the books, the portraits, the symbols of their legacy. "Father's reputation in this town would be annihilated. Mother would have a complete breakdown. And my scholarship," he said, his voice rising with a frantic edge. "My scholarship to Yale, they would pull it in a second. Everything I have worked for, my entire life, gone. Because of this mess." I sat there, frozen in the armchair, the woolen blanket from that other night feeling like a shroud. I listened as he spoke of the family name, of his future, of the shame, of the disgrace. He spoke of us and the family, but his words were a whirlwind that revolved entirely around himself. I was not a person in his equation. I was not his sister who had been brutalized and was now facing an impossible horror. I was a problem. A complication, a mess that threatened the perfect, gilded trajectory of his life. A small, broken part of me still tried to fight. "But Jacob," I said, my voice trembling. "It was him. He's the one who did this. He has to. He has to be held responsible." Michael stopped his pacing. He turned to face me fully, and the look in his eyes extinguished the last ember of hope inside me. The panic was gone, replaced by a chilling, absolute resolve. The look on his face was one I had never seen before, but I recognized it instantly. It was the same look of cold control our father wore when he was about to win a case. "I've already spoken to Jacob," he said. The 6 words struck me with the force of a physical blow. The air rushed from my lungs. The room swam before my eyes. "I've already spoken to Jacob. He had not come to me. He had not asked me what I wanted. He had gone to my abuser." They had conferred. They had become collaborators. The we that I thought included me had shifted. The real we was him and Jacob, and I was the thing they were discussing. My protector had been negotiating with my monster. "What?" I breathed. "I had to," he said, his tone defensive, yet utterly certain of his own righteousness. "He's part of this. We have to be logical. We have a plan." And then he laid it out. He spoke calmly, rationally, as if he were outlining a business proposal. He and Jacob had agreed. The problem had to be dealt with quietly and efficiently. They would handle everything. They would tell our parents a story. They would find a place for me to go until it was over. They would arrange for the issue to be taken care of. He never used the word baby again. It was an issue, a situation, a complication. He spoke with the detached precision of a surgeon planning to remove a tumor, and I finally understood that in his eyes, that is what I was carrying. That is what I had become. In that moment, in the oppressive silence of that library, I saw the truth in all its hideous clarity. Jacob was the fist, but Michael was the architect. Jacob was the mindless violence of a storm, battering down whatever was in his path. But Michael was the cold, patient engineer who surveyed the wreckage and built a dam, not to save anyone, but to channel the destructive waters away from his own precious fields. Jacob's cruelty was simple, animalistic. Michael's was the complex, calculated cruelty of a brilliant mind dedicated solely to its own preservation. His betrayal was not a moment of weakness or a frightened reaction. It was a choice, a logical, well-reasoned decision to sacrifice his sister to save himself. It was a betrayal so profound, so absolute, it made Jacob's predictable brutality seem almost honest in comparison. He finished speaking, looking at me as if expecting my gratitude for his cleverness, for his willingness to manage my disgrace. I said nothing. There were no words left. There was only a vast, silent scream trapped inside my chest, the scream of a girl who had just realized that her savior and her tormentor were two sides of the same monstrous coin. I was more alone now than I had ever been, adrift in a sea of my family's making, and both of my brothers were standing on the shore, watching me drown. The war was over. I had lost. In the suffocating silence of the library that night, after Michael had laid out the cold architecture of my future, something inside me broke for the final time. It was not a loud, shattering break, but a quiet, internal collapse, the way a building implodes, leaving nothing but dust in a hollow space where something once stood. What followed was not combat, but the cold logistics of my surrender. The atmosphere in the house shifted overnight. My brothers, once separated by their different roles, now moved with a shared, terrible purpose. They were a unit, a conspiracy of two. I would see them in quiet conversation in the foyer, their heads bent together, their voices too low for me to hear. I would see them exchange brisk, meaningful nods across the dinner table. They were no longer the golden boy and the charismatic star. They were the architects and the enforcers of my exile. Michael was my handler, his every word now a command disguised as a kindness. Jacob was the silent, menacing presence that guaranteed my compliance. I was no longer their sister. I was their problem, their project, the package they were preparing for shipment. The family court was convened on a Sunday afternoon after church. The living room, with its pristine furniture and portraits of dead ancestors, served as the courtroom. My parents sat on the floral sofa, their posture stiff and expectant. I was seated in a straight-backed chair opposite them, a prisoner in the dock. Michael stood by the fireplace, the natural position of authority, while Jacob leaned against the doorframe, a casual, watchful guard. It was a masterful performance led by Michael. He did not speak of pregnancy or disgrace. He spoke the language of concern, a language our parents understood and welcomed. He used words he'd gleaned from books, words that sounded clinical and authoritative. He spoke of my prolonged melancholia, my increasing social withdrawal, my bouts of hysteria, a cruel and brilliant twisting of the times I had cried out for help. He painted a picture of a sensitive girl whose nerves had finally frayed, whose mind was turning against her. "We're worried, Mother, Father," he said, his voice a perfect blend of solemnity and filial duty. "Emma isn't herself. She needs professional care. She needs to rest, away from the pressures of home." Jacob played his part with chilling perfection. He stepped forward, his face a mask of heartbroken worry. "I've seen it too," he said, his voice thick with false emotion. "The other night, I found her just staring into space, weeping. She didn't even know I was there. It was like she was gone." It was a cry for help. He looked at me then, his eyes daring me to contradict him, knowing I was already silenced, already condemned. And then Michael delivered the solution they had so carefully crafted. He spoke of a wonderful facility in another state, a place specializing in nervous disorders in young women. a quiet pastoral rest home where I could heal. It was not a mental institution, he stressed, but a place for therapeutic convalescence. To the outside world, to the prying eyes of Havenwood, they would construct another lie. They would say I had gone to care for a distant, ailing aunt. A story that was both noble and vague, designed to deflect any further questions. It was a lie wrapped in a lie, a fortress of deceit with me buried at its heart. I watched my parents' faces. I saw no suspicion, no demand for details, no parental instinct to protect their daughter. What I saw with horrifying clarity was relief, my unpredictable sadness, my morning sickness, which they had dismissed as a weak constitution, my reclusiveness. It had all been a source of quiet anxiety for them, a crack in the perfect facade of their family. My brothers had not given them a problem. They had given them a name for the problem, and a neat, tidy solution that would remove it from sight. "Oh, my poor girl," my mother said, her hand fluttering to her chest. The pity in her voice was for herself, for the inconvenience of having a difficult daughter. My father nodded, his expression grim and decisive. "If it's what she needs, then it's what we'll do. The boy is right. We'll handle it." The boy was Michael. The it was me. The verdict had been delivered. My sentence was exile. The next few days passed in a surreal haze. The house was filled with a quiet, efficient bustle, the preparations for my departure. My mother packed a suitcase for me, folding drab, sensible blouses and wool skirts, the wardrobe of an invalid. She did not ask me what I wanted to bring. I was not consulted. I was a ghost, watching the arrangements for my own burial. I heard her on the phone with one of her garden club friends, her voice dripping with a practiced, saccharine sympathy. "Yes, it's such a worry. Our dear Emma. Her nerves are just shattered. The doctor feels a long rest in the country is for the best." Each word was a shovelful of dirt, burying me deeper and deeper in their lie. The morning of the journey was cold and gray, the sky the color of slate. The farewell in the foyer was brief and sterile. My mother gave me a stiff, papery hug, her cheek barely brushing mine. "Be a good girl, Emma," she whispered. "Just get well." My father placed a hand on my shoulder, a gesture that was meant to be reassuring, but felt like a brand. "Do as your brothers say," he commanded. Their eyes held no sadness, only a desperate, urgent need for me to be gone. Then I was in the back of our father's Buick, a cavernous, dark space that smelled of leather and Michael's ambition. Michael drove, his hands gripping the steering wheel at 10 and 2, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. Jacob sat in the passenger seat, an arm resting casually on the open window, the king of this small, mobile kingdom. That drive was not measured in miles, but in the slow, methodical death of hope. I watched Havenwood recede through the rear window, the familiar houses and trees of my childhood blurring into a watercolor of loss. I watched the landscape change from the mountains of Colorado to the flat, endless plains of the heartland. I was no longer Emma Albright, the quiet girl who liked to draw. I was cargo, a secret being transported across state lines. Jacob was smugly, peacefully silent. He turned on the radio, and the cheerful pop songs of the era filled the car, a grotesque soundtrack to my descent. He hummed along, tapping his fingers on the dashboard. He had won. He had taken everything from me, and now he was being rewarded with a pleasant drive in the country, free of all consequence. Occasionally, his eyes would meet mine in the rearview mirror, and I would see a flicker of pure, triumphant malice. Michael never looked back. Not once. For hundreds of miles, he stared straight ahead, his jaw set, his expression unreadable. His silence was not the silence of guilt or remorse. It was the silence of grim, focused execution. He was the architect overseeing the final phase of his project. By refusing to meet my eyes, he was completing his act of erasure. He was making me disappear long before we ever reached our destination. I was not his sister anymore. I was not even a person. I was a task he had to complete. As the sun began to set, casting long, mournful shadows across the highway, I finally understood. The girl who had left Havenwood that morning was gone forever. She had died somewhere on that long, straight road, somewhere between a cheerful song on the radio and a brother who refused to see her. The person who remained was a hollow shell, a ghost being chauffeured to her own haunting. Late that night, we turned off the main highway onto a dark, unpaved road. The headlights cut a weak swath through a tunnel of overgrown trees. At the end of the road was a tall, wrought-iron gate. Behind it, a single light burned in the window of a large, austere brick building that loomed out of the darkness. Michael cut the engine. The sudden silence was absolute, broken only by the chirping of crickets. The journey was over. The lie had been delivered to its final destination. I looked at the dark, imposing structure that was to be my prison, my tomb. They had not just brought me to a place of exile. They had brought me to my own grave, and I was expected to climb into it politely. The gate opened with a low, metallic groan, a sound of grim welcome. The Buick crunched over the gravel driveway and came to a stop before the main entrance of the brick building. Its name was not advertised on any sign. It was a place that had no need for a name, only a purpose. It was a repository for secrets, a place where inconvenient lives were put on hold. My brothers did not wait for me to move. Jacob came around and opened my door with an air of brisk impatience. Michael was already speaking with a formidable-looking woman in a starched white uniform who had emerged from the front door as if summoned. She was the matron, a woman whose face was a study in stern neutrality, her eyes holding no flicker of warmth or curiosity. They were the eyes of a person who had seen every form of human misery and had long ago decided it was a tedious, logistical problem. I was escorted inside. The air was thick with the competing smells of industrial-strength disinfectant and boiled cabbage, a scent I would forever associate with quiet despair. The floors were polished to a dull sheen, but marred by the scuffs and scrapes of years of reluctant feet. We walked down a long, dim hallway. I caught glimpses into a common room where several other young women sat, all in various stages of pregnancy. They were ghosts, just like me. They stared out windows, listlessly knitted, or simply sat, their hands resting on their swollen bellies. No one spoke. They were islands of private shame, adrift in a sea of communal silence. We were all daughters of good families, our presence here a testament to a secret that had to be kept at all costs. The matron led us to a small Spartan office. She spoke only to Michael, her tone businesslike and detached. I was not part of the conversation. I was its subject. My name was entered into a large leather-bound ledger. My suitcase was taken by an orderly. Michael handed the matron a thick envelope, presumably filled with the money that would pay for my silence and my confinement. He then turned to me, his face unreadable. "Do as they say, Emma," he said, his voice low and final. "Behave yourself. We'll be back when it's time." Jacob, who had been lingering by the door, gave me one last look. It was not a look of pity or remorse. It was a smirk of final, absolute victory. He had gotten everything he wanted. He had sated his cruelties, and now his brilliant brother was cleaning up the mess, ensuring his name would remain untarnished. The heavy oak door closed behind them, the sound echoing down the hall, and my new life, my life as a prisoner of their plan, began. The months that followed bled into one another, a monotonous blur of gray days. The routine was rigid and designed to numb the mind. We woke at dawn, ate simple, tasteless meals in a silent dining hall, performed light chores, folding laundry, polishing silver, and were ordered to our rooms for mandatory rest periods. There was no therapy, no counseling, no pretense of healing. The facility's only function was to contain us, to manage the biological process until the evidence could be disposed of, and then to release us back into the world, hollowed out and sworn to secrecy. My body continued its slow, inexorable transformation. The sickness of the early weeks gave way to a burgeoning roundness that I could no longer hide. As the life inside me grew, it began to move. At first, it was a faint, fluttery sensation, like the wings of a trapped bird. Then it became stronger, a definite nudge, a kick, a rolling motion under my skin. A strange and terrible paradox took root in my soul. This life was still the sickness, the living proof of my violation, a constant physical reminder of Jacob's crime, and yet the sheer, stubborn vitality of it, the insistent presence, sparked a flicker of something primal and protective within me. It was not love. It was something far more complicated, a sense of a shared, doomed existence. We were two prisoners in the same cell, one made of brick and mortar, the other of my own flesh. Letters from home were rare. When they came, they had been opened and read by the matron before being passed on to me. They were filled with my mother's bright, brittle chatter about garden parties, town gossip, and the successes of my brothers. Michael was excelling in his pre-law studies. Jacob had been named Employee of the Month at our father's firm. Every cheerful word was a torment, a reminder of the vast, intricate lie my life had become. They were not writing to their daughter. They were writing to a fictional character, the girl who was dutifully caring for a sick aunt, a girl who had never been more pure or more distant. The end came on a cold, rainy night in early spring. The first pains were a dull ache in my back, which soon sharpened into wrenching, rhythmic contractions. I was moved from my small room to the infirmary, a place I had not yet seen. It was not a delivery room. It was a sterile, white-tiled chamber that felt more like a laboratory. It was cold, lit by a single, harsh overhead bulb, and contained nothing but a narrow bed with metal stirrups and a steel table. The stern nurse from my first day was my only attendant. She was efficient, her movements practiced and devoid of all emotion. She did not offer a hand to hold, nor a word of comfort. Her instructions were curt, medical commands. Breathe. Bear down. Don't make so much noise. The hours that followed were a blur of agony and dissociation. The pain was a red tide, pulling me under, tossing me against the rocks of my own body. I was no longer a person. I was a biological event, a process to be managed. I floated again, just as I had on the kitchen floor, watching the ordeal from a great distance, and then, through the haze of pain, I heard it. A sound that cut through everything, a thin, wavering, but shockingly loud cry. It was the sound of a new life, a new voice in the world that had, until that moment, only contained my own silent screams. For a single, solitary second, a fierce, maternal instinct I didn't know I possessed surged through me. My arms, empty and aching, lifted from the bed, reaching for the source of that sound. My baby, I rasped, the words raw in my throat. But the nurse was quicker. She moved with practiced speed, cutting the cord, wrapping the crying infant in a rough, white blanket, and turning her back to me. I saw nothing but a small, squirming bundle and a flash of dark, wet hair before she walked swiftly out of the room, leaving me alone with the echo of that cry. My arms fell back onto the mattress. Empty. They had not even let me see if it was a boy or a girl. The cruelty was by design, a surgical severing of any potential bond. I was wheeled to a different room, small and clean, and left alone. Exhaustion washed over me, but sleep would not come. The phantom feeling of the life that had inhabited my body for 9 months was now a cavernous, aching void. 2 days later, my brothers returned. They looked crisp and clean in their suits, alien beings from another world, standing awkwardly in the drab, sterile room. They did not ask how I was. They did not mention the birth. They were here on business. Michael held a sheaf of papers and a pen. "It's time to sign the papers, Emma," he said, his voice flat, emotionless. He sat on the edge of the chair by my bed, all business. "It's a standard closed adoption agreement. It's for the best. The child will be placed with a good family, a family that can provide a clean start. It's better this way." He spread the papers on the thin blanket covering my legs. My eyes scanned the legal jargon, the words blurring together. Then I saw it, the line for the father's name. It was starkly, officially blank. Unknown. "This protects everyone involved," Michael said, his gaze not meeting mine. He was not just protecting Jacob from legal responsibility. He was erasing him from the story, erasing my trauma from the official record. I was being legally coerced into participating in my own silencing. I looked from the papers to Michael's face, then to Jacob, who stood by the door, a silent, impatient sentinel. There was no choice. There never had been. Michael placed the pen in my hand. My fingers were weak, clumsy. He gently, firmly, guided my hand to the signature line, his touch cold and reptilian. I watched as my own hand formed the letters of my name, signing away my child, my story, my brief, agonizing claim to motherhood. "It's over now," Michael said, neatly gathering the papers. He stood up, the transaction complete. "We'll be back in a week to take you home. You can put all of this behind you." Forget it ever happened. Forget? The word was so absurd, so casually cruel, it almost made me laugh. It was like asking a soldier to forget a war by simply handing him a clean uniform. They left. I was alone again in the white room, in the deafening silence. The baby was gone. I didn't know its name. I didn't know its face. I didn't know if I had given birth to a son or a daughter. It was simply the unnamed child, a ghost who would haunt me for the rest of my days. I lay back against the flat pillows, a hollowed-out vessel, an empty room in a house of lies, waiting to be shipped back home to resume my life as a ghost. The journey home was a silent study in contrasts. The landscape outside the car window rewound itself, the flat plains giving way to the gentle rise of the foothills, and finally, the familiar majestic peaks of the Rockies. The car was the same, the brothers were the same, but I was not. The terrified girl they had driven out of Havenwood months ago was gone, left behind in a sterile room in a nameless institution. The person they were driving back was a hollowed-out thing, a vessel scrubbed clean of the life it had briefly carried, filled now with nothing but a cold, heavy emptiness. My brothers, relieved that their problem had been so efficiently solved, were more relaxed. Michael even attempted a grotesque imitation of normal conversation, remarking on the good weather and the progress of a highway construction project. He was plastering over the chasm between us with the thin mortar of meaningless words. Jacob, back to his arrogant self, turned the radio dial until he found a baseball game, filling the car with the cheerful, distant roar of a crowd. I said nothing. I simply stared out the window, watching the world pass by, a film projected onto a screen I was no longer part of. My silence on the way there had been the silence of a lamb being led to slaughter, a silence born of pure terror. My silence on the way back was different. It was the silence of the stone that would one day mark a grave. It was heavy, absolute, and impenetrable. When we pulled into the driveway of the house on Elm Street, my parents were waiting on the porch, their faces arranged in expressions of loving relief. It was another scene in their meticulously crafted play. "Emma, darling, you're back!" my mother cried, rushing down the steps to embrace me. Her hug was light, her perfume enveloping me in a cloud of familiar falsehood. "Oh, you look so much rested. The country air has done you a world of good." My father patted my shoulder, his gruff version of affection. "Welcome home, girl. Good to have you back on your feet." They were welcoming back the character they had created, Emma, the fragile girl who had recovered from a bout of nervous exhaustion. They looked at me and saw what they wanted to see, a problem resolved, a potential scandal averted. They did not see the hollows under my eyes, or the new, unnerving stillness in my posture. I walked back into the house. It was exactly as I had left it. The same polished floors, the same scent of lavender and pipe tobacco, the same oppressive quiet. My bedroom was pristine, the floral comforter turned down invitingly, a fresh glass of water on the nightstand. It was as if I had just returned from a pleasant, uneventful vacation. This performance of absolute normalcy was more chilling, more insane than any overt cruelty could ever be. They were not just ignoring the truth, they were trying to annihilate it with domesticity. The new house rule was established that very first night, at the dinner table. It was an unspoken decree, but its power was absolute. We will not speak of the past 6 months. The time I was away was a void, a black hole in our family's history, and we were all expected to navigate around its edges without ever acknowledging its existence. The meal was a masterpiece of denial. My mother chattered about a recent spat at her garden club. My father recounted a minor legal victory. Michael, with an air of profound seriousness, discussed the philosophical complexities of a book he was reading for his ethics class, a hypocrisy so staggering it was almost sublime. Jacob boasted about a commission he had earned at our father's firm, flashing a new, expensive watch. They talked and talked, their voices weaving a thick tapestry of trivialities to cover the gaping wound in our family. I sat in my usual place, a ghost at the feast. I pushed the peas around on my plate, cut my chicken into smaller and smaller pieces. I did not speak a single word. My silence was a tangible thing in the room. It was a vacuum that sucked the warmth out of their cheerful conversation. I could feel them fighting against it, talking louder, laughing more brightly, their gazes skittering away from me whenever I looked up. We were all actors in a play, and the script's most important direction was to pretend the main character, the one with the hole in her soul, wasn't really there. My silence was the dark star at the center of our family's galaxy, and they just orbited it faster and faster, praying its gravity wouldn't pull them and their perfect world into its depths. Days turned into weeks. I moved through the house and the town like an automaton. I helped my mother in the garden, my hands moving mechanically, pulling weeds. I sat in the library, a book open on my lap, my eyes seeing not the words, but the stark white walls of the infirmary. I took long walks through Havenwood, my face a placid, empty mask that the townspeople mistook for serene recovery. But inside, something was changing. The raw, screaming grief of the first few weeks was beginning to cool, to harden. The helplessness I had felt, the terror that had been my constant companion, it was all being burned away in a slow internal fire, leaving behind something new. It was not hope. It was resolve. The trauma had not broken me, it had forged me. And in the silent forge of my soul, I began to build. I learned to construct a fortress inside my mind. My outward expression became my defense, a blank wall on which others could project whatever they wished to see. The quiet daughter, the shy sister, the recovered patient. But behind that wall, in the heavily guarded keep of my inner self, I was no longer a victim. I was a witness. I was a keeper of accounts. I started to observe. I watched with a new, cold clarity. I saw the way Michael flinched almost imperceptibly whenever I entered a room, a flicker of guilt he quickly suppressed. I saw the way Jacob looked at me, his triumph now mingled with a faint unease at my unreadable silence. I catalogued every oblivious, self-serving comment from my mother, every dismissive gesture from my father. Each casual cruelty, each polite act of erasure was a stone. And I gathered these stones, one by one, and used them to build the walls of my fortress higher and stronger. The artistic, sensitive girl who loved to draw was gone, buried in an unmarked grave in a distant state alongside her unnamed child. In her place stood a watcher. I understood with a certainty that was terrifying in its lucidity that screaming the truth would accomplish nothing. They had already proven that my voice was worthless. My power would not come from an emotional outburst, which they would simply label as another symptom of my illness. My power would come from my silence. It would come from my memory. It would come from my patience. One evening, I stood at my bedroom window, looking down into the backyard. The summer sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet. Michael and Jacob were in the yard, tossing a baseball back and forth. Their movements were easy, athletic, their laughter carrying on the warm air. They were the picture of perfect American brotherhood, the golden sons of Havenwood, without a care in the world. I watched them, and for the first time, I felt nothing. Not the hot sting of tears, not the bitter bile of rage. There was only a vast, cold calm. I was a geologist, studying the slow, inexorable pressures that build beneath the Earth's surface, pressures that can lie dormant for generations before they finally erupt. They thought they had buried the secret. They thought they had won, but they had made a grave miscalculation. They had buried it inside me. And in the dark, silent earth of my soul, they had not planted a memory to be forgotten. They had planted a seed. And I knew, with every fiber of my being, that I would spend the rest of my life tending to it, watering it with my silence, waiting patiently for the day it would finally bear its bitter fruit. The fortress I built inside my mind was a patient place. It was not a citadel of rage, filled with the clamor of battle plans. It was a library, silent and vast, where every memory, every slight, every casual cruelty was meticulously catalogued and cross-referenced. I became its sole, devoted librarian. My life on the outside became the perfect camouflage. I was Emma Albright, the quiet librarian, the town spinster. a figure of gentle pity. Poor Emma, they would say, never married, never left home, such a shame. They saw a life of quiet resignation, a pale, unlived thing. They did not see the slow, steady sharpening of a single, cold purpose. 40 winters came and went. I watched the seasons change from the large, arched window of the Havenwood Public Library, the silence of the reading room, a comfortable echo of the silence I had cultivated within myself. I watched the children who came in for story time grow into teenagers who checked out books for school reports, and then into adults who brought their own children. I was a constant, unchanging feature of the town, as reliable and overlooked as the old clock in the town square. At home, I watched my parents decay. Their vibrant, commanding presences slowly faded, their bodies succumbing to the quiet betrayals of age. I became their caretaker, a role I performed with a correctness that was often mistaken for devotion. I brought my father his medicine, read to him when his eyes grew too weak, and listened to his rambling stories about a past I knew to be a fiction. I tended to my mother as her sharp, social mind softened into a confused fog. In their final years, they became dependent on the daughter they had so efficiently discarded. There was a grim, silent justice in that, but it gave me no pleasure. My feelings for them had been burned away long ago, leaving only a sense of duty, as cool and impersonal as the marble of a tombstone. I stood by their graves, first my father's, then a few years later my mother's. My brothers stood beside me, their faces masks of respectable grief. Michael delivered a eulogy for our father that spoke of integrity and strength. Jacob wept openly at our mother's funeral, a performance of filial piety that was nauseating in its perfection. I shed no tears. I felt no sorrow. I felt only the turning of a page, the quiet closing of a long and suffocating chapter. With their deaths, 2 of my jailers were gone. My brothers, free from the last vestiges of parental oversight, ascended to their thrones. Jacob, who had inherited the bulk of our father's construction business, became a titan of Havenwood. His name was everywhere, on plaques in the hospital lobby, on the programs for charity galas he chaired, on the lips of everyone who mattered. He built a sprawling mansion on the hill overlooking the town, where he lived with his timid, beautifully dressed wife, a woman whose smile, I noticed, never quite reached her eyes. To the world, Jacob Albright was a pillar of the community, but I was the librarian of his sins. I heard the whispers his money couldn't completely silence, of his volcanic temper, of business deals that skirted the edges of the law, of the high turnover of young secretaries at his firm. I saw the cracks in his perfect facade because I was the only one who knew to look for them. Michael became the town's secular saint. He built a thriving law practice based on the very principles he had so thoroughly violated: integrity, trust, and compassion. He was the keeper of secrets, the executor of wills, the man to whom people turned in their moments of greatest vulnerability. The irony was a constant, low-grade fever in my blood. I would see him at town meetings, his expression thoughtful and serious, dispensing wisdom, and I would feel the memory of his cold, pragmatic voice in the library, sentencing me to a living death. He had built his immaculate life on the foundations of my ruin, and I continued my quiet existence. I lived in the old house on Elm Street, a ghost in a house of ghosts. The town saw me as a relic, a sad footnote to the grand story of the Albright family. They did not know that the quiet librarian spent her evenings not reading novels, but studying finance, poring over books on corporate law and estate planning. They did not know that my mind had become a map of my brothers' lives, their businesses, their investments, their social connections. I learned to read the financial pages as other women read recipes. I was patient. My purpose had not faded with the passing decades. It had clarified, distilled into a single, crystalline point. But I lacked the one thing I needed to begin. I lacked leverage. I lacked a key. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in early spring, a thin, unassuming envelope in a stack of bills and junk mail. It was from a law firm in a neighboring state. My great-aunt, my grandmother's sister, a woman I had met only a handful of times as a small child, had passed away. Her own children had predeceased her, and in her will, she had left a small portion of her estate to me. I went to the bank that Friday and deposited the check. It was not a fortune. It would not have paid for one of the chandeliers in Jacob's mansion. It was a modest sum, but as I looked at the deposit slip, at the number printed in neat black ink, a tremor went through me. For my entire life, every dollar I had ever possessed had come from my father's hand, or from the meager salary paid by the town, a salary indirectly approved by a town council on which my brothers held immense influence. All of it was their money, Albright money, the currency of my imprisonment. But this was different. This money was mine. It was untainted, clean. It had come from outside the suffocating ecosystem of my family. It was a gift from a ghost, a key delivered by a woman I barely knew. It was agency. It was power. It was the beginning. That evening, I sat at the small, simple desk in my bedroom. The house was silent around me. My brothers were in their own grand homes, living their grand lives, having long ago forgotten the details of the secret that had built their kingdoms. They saw me as a harmless, irrelevant fixture, a piece of old family furniture. They had no idea that the fortress they had trapped me in had become my war room. I looked at my reflection in the dark window pane, an aging woman, her hair streaked with gray, her face a quiet mask. But my eyes were not the eyes of a sad, lonely spinster. They were clear, focused, and cold. Money is a vulgar thing, but it is also a key. And after 40 winters of waiting in a locked room, I was finally ready to find the door. I picked up a pen, a fresh, sharp-nibbed fountain pen, and pulled a clean sheet of paper from the drawer. I did not begin a letter or a diary entry. I began to make a list. The first item I wrote was not a name or a number. It was a single word. Lawyer. The ghost was done with haunting. It was time to hunt. The word lawyer sat at the top of the page, stark and absolute. It was not just an item on a list. It was a declaration of war. But wars are not won with declarations. They are won with strategy, with intelligence, and with the careful selection of one's weapons. My first move would not be a clumsy, emotional outburst. It would be a quiet, precise, and perfectly aimed shot, fired from the shadows. My research began in the place I knew best, the library. For 40 years, I had helped others navigate the labyrinth of human knowledge. Now, I turned those skills inward, using them to forge a weapon. The internet, a tool that had not existed when my long wait began, became my greatest ally. In the quiet hours after the library had closed, I sat at a terminal in the back, the glow of the screen illuminating my face, and I began to hunt. My criteria were strict. The lawyer could not be from Havenwood, or even from the surrounding counties. My brother Michael's influence was like a root system, spreading unseen through the legal soil of our community. To hire a local attorney would be to alert my enemy to the coming battle. I needed an outsider, someone immune to the Albright name and the power it represented. I narrowed my search to the big firms in Denver, 2 hours away. I wasn't looking for a criminal lawyer or a crusader for victims' rights. My pain was the fuel, but it would not be the engine of my plan. An accusation of assault, 60 years after the fact, would be a he-said, she-said nightmare, easily dismissed as the ramblings of a bitter, lonely old woman. No, I needed a different kind of warrior. I searched for specialists in fiduciary law, probate litigation, and forensic accounting. I needed someone who understood that the greatest crimes are often not written in blood, but in the nearly invisible ink of a balance sheet. I cross-referenced names with news archives, looking for articles about contentious estate battles and complex financial disputes. I was looking for a pattern of tenacity, a history of taking on powerful, well-defended opponents and winning. After 3 weeks of methodical searching, one name remained at the top of my list: Sarah Chen. The articles described her as a financial pit bull, a brilliant legal mind with an accountant's eye for detail. She had successfully challenged the wills of powerful patriarchs and dismantled trusts that were designed to be impenetrable. There was a photo of her on her firm's website. She was younger than I expected, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to look right through the camera, and a firm set to her jaw that suggested she did not suffer fools gladly. She was perfect. Making the phone call was a monumental act. For decades, my voice had been a tool for quiet service. "Can I help you find a book?" "The library is closing in 10 minutes. Now I had to use it to command, to initiate. I practiced in the mirror, my voice shaky at first, then growing steadier. I called her office from a payphone in a neighboring town. I was discreet, giving away nothing. I simply stated that I was the beneficiary of a complex family estate and required a consultation regarding its administration. The cool, professional voice of her assistant booked me an appointment for the following week. The drive to Denver was the inverse of the journey I had taken with my brothers all those years ago. Then, I was cargo, a piece of human contraband being delivered to my prison. Now, I was in command. I took the bus, a free and anonymous agent, watching the familiar landscape give way to the sprawling anonymity of the city. I found the feeling of being a stranger among millions, an unread book on a vast shelf, to be profoundly liberating. Sarah Chen's office was on the 32nd floor of a sleek glass and steel tower that scraped the sky. It was a world of cool grays, polished chrome, and abstract art, a universe away from the dusty, overwrought gentility of Havenwood. This was a place of modern power, a place where fortunes were made and unmade through the precise application of law and logic. Sarah greeted me with a polite, professional smile. She was even more formidable in person, her intelligence a palpable energy in the room. As she looked at me, I saw exactly what she saw. Miss Emma Albright, a 75-year-old librarian from the mountains, a spinster in a sensible cardigan, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her face a mask of placid quiet. I could see the assumptions forming behind her sharp eyes. She thought she knew what this was about, a simple will dispute, a petty grievance, the kind of small-town family squabble she could resolve with a few sharply worded letters. She was courteous, but I could sense she was already mentally filing me away under routine. "So, Miss Albright," she began, her voice smooth and professional. "Thank you for coming in. Your message said you had concerns about a family estate. How can I help you?" I met her gaze and did not flinch. My voice, when I spoke, was as quiet and steady as I had rehearsed. "Ms. Chen, my parents, Richard and Carol Albright, passed away some years ago. My two brothers, Jacob and Michael Albright, were the executors of their estate." "I see," she said, making a note on a legal pad. "And you have a concern about the distribution?" "My concern," I said, choosing my words with surgical precision, "is with the entirety of the administration. I was a silent partner in my family's business, a position inherited from my mother. I have reason to believe that for the past several decades, my brothers have systematically breached their fiduciary duty to me. I believe they have undervalued assets, diverted profits, and managed the various family trusts in a manner that has exclusively benefited them, at my direct and substantial expense." I saw a flicker of surprise in her eyes. I had not used the language of a distraught and confused old woman. I had used the language of her profession. Still, her skepticism was a shield. "Miss Albright, your brothers are extremely well-respected figures. Albright Construction is one of the biggest firms in the region, and Michael Albright's law practice has an impeccable reputation. These are very serious allegations. Do you have any documents, any specific evidence to support them?" This was the moment. This was the pivot on which my entire plan turned. "No," I said calmly. "I do not have a single piece of paper that proves what I am saying." I saw the polite, dismissive look beginning to form on her face again, and I cut it off. "Mrs. Chen, if I had concrete evidence, I would have sent it to you in a letter. I wouldn't need to hire a lawyer of your caliber. What I have are observations. I have inconsistencies. I have 40 years of watching and listening from a room where nobody thought I was paying attention. I am not hiring you to act on proof. I am hiring you to find the proof." I reached into my handbag and retrieved the bank statement showing the deposit of my inheritance. I slid it across the polished desk. "This is my retainer," I said. "I want you to conduct a complete forensic audit of my family's financial history, starting from the day my father died. I want you to examine every trust, every transaction, every partnership agreement. I want you to unravel everything my brothers have ever built." Sarah stared at the paper, then back at me. The polite, professional mask was gone. The assumptions she had made about the quiet little librarian were evaporating. She was a predator who had just realized the timid rabbit in her office was actually a wolf in sheep's clothing. For the first time, she looked at me not as a client, but as a puzzle, a story far deeper and darker than she had imagined. "Miss Albright," she said, her voice now stripped of its smooth veneer, replaced by a sharp, genuine curiosity. "An investigation of this scope would be incredibly aggressive. And very, very expensive. It would require subpoenas, auditors. It would be all-out war." I leaned forward slightly, my hands still folded neatly in my lap. "I am 75 years old, Miss Chen. I am not concerned with expense, and I have been waiting a very long time." I let a small, cold smile touch my lips. "I am an exceptionally patient woman." The dynamic in the room had irrevocably shifted. I was no longer a pitiable spinster. I was a formidable client with a singular, unbending will. Sarah Chen leaned back in her chair, a slow, appreciative smile spreading across her own face. It was the smile of a warrior who has just been presented with a worthy and fascinating fight. I walked out of that tall glass building and into the bright Denver sunlight. For the first time since I was a girl, I felt its warmth on my face without a shadow of fear. I had not told her the story of my pain, of the cold kitchen floor or the unnamed child. I had told her the story of my inheritance. I had given her the map, the key, and the funding, and now the hunt for my family's buried sins could finally begin. The first move in a war is rarely a cannon shot. It is the quiet movement of troops under the cover of darkness, the dispatch of a scout, the delivery of a single, formal message. My war began with an email from Sarah Chen, its subject line a masterpiece of bland corporate neutrality. Albright Estate Inquiry. "Dear Miss Albright," it read. "Pursuant to our discussion, we have filed the initial petitions for discovery with the County Probate Court. We have formally requested complete access to all documents pertaining to the estates of Richard and Carol Albright, as well as the charter and financial records for all affiliated family trusts and partnerships. We will keep you apprised of any response." It was the most thrilling piece of correspondence I had ever received. The scout had been dispatched. The first, quiet arrow had been fired into the heart of my brother's kingdom. The response, when it came a week later, was exactly what I had expected. Sarah forwarded me the letter from Michael's law firm. It was a symphony of dismissive arrogance. Michael expressed his profound disappointment and confusion at this unnecessary and frivolous action. He painted a picture of me as his beloved but sadly confused elderly sister, suggesting I was being manipulated by opportunistic lawyers. He assured the court that his administration of the family's affairs had been impeccable and transparent, and that he would, of course, comply with any legal requirements, though he considered it a waste of everyone's time. He had underestimated me. It was the first critical mistake of a man who had never once in his life considered me his equal. What Michael didn't know was that his opponent wasn't just Sarah Chen, the brilliant lawyer. His true opponent was the quiet librarian who had spent 40 years building a faultless, encyclopedic memory of our family's history. The partnership between me and Sarah became the engine of our investigation. She was the legal force, the one who could compel the release of documents and decipher the dense language of the law. I was the context, the human index, the one who could breathe life and meaning into the dead numbers on a page. Our phone calls became a weekly ritual. "Emma," Sarah would say, her voice crisp and focused. "We have the documents for the sale of the old quarry land from 30 years back. The sale price looks suspiciously low." I would close my eyes, and the fortress of my mind would open its archives. "The quarry," I'd say, my own voice calm and clear. "That was the year Jacob decided he wanted to buy a string of racehorses. Father was furious. He called it a foolish extravagance and refused to give him the money. They had a terrible argument." A week later, my brothers told me they had to sell the quarry land at a loss to cover some unexpected business expenses. Jacob got his horses. On Sarah's end, I would hear the frantic scratching of her pen. A low sale price was a suspicion. A low sale price connected to a sudden, unexplained need for cash by a man like my brother Jacob was a motive. It was a bright red flag, pointing her team toward the Shell Corporation that had bought the land and resold it 6 months later for 5 times the price. Another call. "We're looking at the trust your mother established for you. On paper, it's designed for your care. But the discretionary powers given to the trustee, your brother Michael, are absolute. He's been paying himself an exorbitant management fee for decades. Again, I provided the memory. My mother told me, a month before she died, that she was worried about me. She said she had made sure there was a special fund, her own money, that would always take care of me, so I would never have to depend on my brothers. She wanted me to be independent. Michael had taken our mother's dying wish, her one true act of protection, and twisted its legal language into a cage, creating a system where he could systematically bleed my inheritance dry while appearing to be my dutiful financial guardian. He had not just stolen my money, he had desecrated our mother's memory. For months, the documents poured into Sarah's office. Boxes and boxes of them. Bank statements, deeds, partnership agreements, tax returns dating back half a century. It was my family's entire history, rendered in numbers and legalese. Sarah's team, a small group of sharp young associates and a ferociously intelligent forensic accountant, began to piece it all together. I imagined it as a great tangled knot of thread. At first, it seemed hopelessly complex, a lifetime of transactions designed by Michael to be impenetrable. But with my memories as their guide, they found a loose end, and then another and another. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to pull, and the great Albright knot began to unravel. The discoveries came piece by piece, a paper trail of sin that stretched across the decades. The undervalued land sales were a consistent pattern. The skimming of profits from Jacob's construction company, funneled into private accounts shielded by corporations Michael had created, was a constant, steady drain. They had borrowed against my share of the family business without my knowledge, using the loans to fund their own lavish lifestyles. They had sold family art and antiques, telling me the pieces were in storage, and pocketed the cash. It was a conspiracy of 1,000 small cuts. There was no single dramatic smoking gun. The evidence was the sheer, overwhelming weight of the pattern itself. It was death by 1,000 documents. After 6 months of relentless digging, Sarah's forensic accountant laid it all out on a conference table: spreadsheets, flowcharts, and highlighted documents, a web of deceit so intricate and so comprehensive that it was, in its own way, a work of genius, a monument to my brother's greed and their utter contempt for me. As Sarah explained the full scope of it to me over the phone, I felt a strange and terrible vindication. It had never been just about the money. The money was a symbol. It was the measure of the worth they had assigned to me, which was nothing. By keeping me poor, they had kept me powerless. They had ensured the quiet spinster in the old house on Elm Street could never become a threat, could never afford to seek help, could never build a life of her own. The financial fraud was not a separate crime. It was the long, cold, calculated continuation of the violence that had begun on the kitchen floor 60 years earlier. They hadn't just stolen my inheritance. They had stolen my future, again. The investigation phase was coming to a close. The quiet movement of troops was over. Our army was assembled, our intelligence complete. One evening, the phone rang. It was Sarah. Her voice was different. The professional curiosity of our first meetings was gone. The focused intensity of the investigation was gone. Her voice was now the voice of a general on the eve of a battle she knows she will win. It was cold, hard, and utterly confident. "Emma," she said, and there was no preamble. "We have it. We have it all." I could hear the rustle of papers on her end. "It's worse and better than we ever imagined. The paper trail isn't just a trail. It's a 6-lane superhighway of fraud, and we have the deeds to every mile. Your brothers didn't just cut you out. They built an entire financial empire on top of what they stole from you." I stood by the window in my quiet, lonely house, looking out into the darkness. I felt the fortress inside me, its walls now buttressed by boxes of evidence, its towers flying the flag of Sarah Chen's law firm. "Now," Sarah's voice cut through the silence, sharp as a shard of glass. "It's time to decide how we use it." The decision of how to use the weapon was the final, most important part of the strategy. A long, drawn-out court battle would be messy, public, and would still, in some way, allow my brothers to control the narrative, to paint me as a vindictive, embittered woman, Sarah and I decided on a different approach. Not a public war, but a private execution. We would give them no time to prepare, no room to maneuver. We would corner them in their own territory and present them with the inescapable truth of their ruin. The setting we chose was Michael's law office. It was his fortress of integrity, the very symbol of the respectable life he had built upon my silent suffering. There could be no more fitting place for it all to come crashing down. The pretext for the meeting was a formal, typed letter sent from my address on my own stationery. It spoke of a desire to discuss the final disposition of our remaining shared family assets, specifically the old house on Elm Street. It was deliberately bland, designed to appeal to their greed. They would see it as their confused old sister finally deciding to sell the last piece of the pie, and they would come, eager to swindle me one last time. They would walk into the meeting expecting to be predators. They had no idea they were the prey. On the day of the meeting, I dressed in my uniform of invisibility. A simple gray dress, my favorite worn cardigan, sensible flat shoes. I was the town librarian, the harmless spinster. My calm was my armor. My silence was my sword. Sarah and I drove to Denver together. She was dressed in a sharp, dark gray suit, her demeanor cool and focused. In her briefcase was not the mountain of evidence, but a single spiral-bound document for each of my brothers. It was a summary, a concise and utterly damning executive report on their lives as thieves. We arrived early and were shown to the conference room by Michael's polite young receptionist. The room was suffocatingly tasteful. A long, polished mahogany table, plush leather chairs, walls lined with framed diplomas and photos of Michael shaking hands with the governor. It smelled of success and lemon polish. I chose the chair at the head of the table, the seat my father and later Michael had always occupied. Sarah sat to my right, placing her briefcase on the table with a soft, definitive click. My brothers arrived together, 5 minutes late, an assertion of their importance. They strode in, bringing with them a gale of arrogant confidence. "Emma," Michael said, his tone one of weary indulgence. He gave Sarah a cursory nod, dismissing her as unimportant. "What's this all about? Jacob and I are very busy men." Jacob didn't even bother with a greeting. He simply took a seat, pulling out his phone, already bored. I said nothing. I looked at my hands, folded neatly on the table in front of me, and then I turned my gaze to Sarah. The gesture was a silent transfer of command, an act that went completely unnoticed by my brothers. "Gentlemen," Sarah began, her voice calm and even, cutting through their entitlement. "Thank you for coming. Miss Albright has asked me to present you with a summary of our findings regarding the 60-year administration of the Albright family estate and its various affiliated enterprises." She opened her briefcase and slid one of the bound documents across the polished table to each of them. Michael frowned, annoyed at this formality. Jacob sighed with theatrical impatience, but picked up the document. I watched their faces as they began to read. I saw Michael's expression shift from annoyance to confusion, then to a dawning, sickening comprehension. His face, usually so composed, began to lose its color. I saw Jacob flip through the pages, his brow furrowed, at first not understanding the complex financial terms, but then his eyes landed on a name, the Shell Corporation he'd used for the quarry sale, and a flicker of animal panic crossed his face. The room was silent, save for the rustle of paper. Sarah let the silence stretch, letting the weight of the information sink in. Then she began to speak, her voice still quiet, clinical, as if she were presenting a particularly dry academic paper. "As you can see on page 4, she said, we've detailed the sale of the quarry lands in 1968, sold for a fraction of its assessed value to a holding company, which, as we've demonstrated on page 5, was secretly owned by you, Mr. Jacob Albright, and then resold 18 months later for a 600% profit. A profit which was never declared as part of the family estate." She continued, her voice a relentless, dispassionate blade. She walked them through the trusts their mother had established, showing how Michael's legal machinations had turned them into his personal slush fund. She detailed the siphoned profits from the construction company, the secret loans, the sold artwork. She had dates, account numbers, and copies of forged signatures. When she was done, she folded her hands on the table. The evidence we have gathered is comprehensive and, I believe you'll agree, irrefutable. It paints a picture of a systematic, decades-long conspiracy to defraud your sister of her rightful inheritance. The total, with interest, amounts to a sum in the high 8 figures. Jacob threw the document onto the table. "This is insane," he snarled, his face flushed with rage. "You have nothing. This is just the fantasy of a crazy old woman." Michael didn't speak. He was a lawyer. He knew what he was looking at. He knew the quality of the research. He knew, with an icy certainty that was visible in the sweat on his forehead, that they were trapped. Ruined. "Which brings us to your options," Sarah said, ignoring Jacob's outburst completely. "Option 1. We hand this entire investigation over to the U.S. Attorney's Office and the IRS. You will both face multiple federal charges for conspiracy, wire fraud, and tax evasion. You will lose your businesses, your law license, your reputations. You will, in all likelihood, go to prison for a very long time." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Or there is option 2. She slid another, much thinner set of papers toward them. "You will sign this legally binding confession to the financial crimes detailed in our report. You will then sign these documents, which cede all your personal and professional assets, your homes, your savings, your shares in Albright Construction, this law firm, everything, into an anonymous trust managed by us to compensate your sister for her losses. In return, this investigation goes no further. You will be left with nothing, but you will have your freedom. You have 1 hour to decide." The rage in Jacob, which had been simmering, finally boiled over. He was a cornered animal, and he could not fight the numbers, so he resorted to the only form of power he had ever truly understood. "You old bitch," he roared, his face turning a dark mottled red. He shoved his chair back so violently it crashed against the wall. "I'll kill you!" He lunged across the corner of the table, his hands reaching for my throat. But before he could reach me, Michael, whose face had been a mask of pure terror, finally broke. It was a sound I will never forget, a raw, ragged scream torn from the depths of his soul. "Jacob, no! Stop! For God's sake, stop it!" He leaped up and grabbed his brother's arm, trying to haul him back, his eyes wild with a panic that went far beyond financial ruin. He saw his life, his reputation, his freedom, all about to be incinerated in a single, violent act. He turned his terrified gaze on Sarah, the dam of 60 years of lies finally bursting. "Don't you see what he's like?" he shrieked, his voice cracking. "I had to. I always had to control it." That night, the baby. I had to hide it. I had to protect the family from him, from this madness. I did it all to stop this from ever coming out. The confession, the real one, the one I had never in my wildest dreams expected to hear, spilled into the pristine, silent air of his beautiful conference room. Jacob froze, stunned into silence by his brother's words. Sarah's expression was one of cold, absolute victory. Her hand moved almost imperceptibly, and I saw the small red recording light on her phone, which had been sitting on the table, blink once. And I sat at the head of the table, perfectly still. I had not flinched. I had not cried out. I had simply watched. I had watched as the brilliant architect, in his terror, took a sledgehammer to the foundations of his own life and brought the entire house of lies crashing down around him. He had just confessed to accessory to rape and kidnapping in front of a licensed officer of the court. He had just given me the one thing all the money in the world could not buy. He had given me a witness. The war was over. And all I had to do was watch. The silence that fell upon the conference room after Michael's confession was a dense, heavy thing, absorbing all the sound and fury that had come before it. Jacob stood frozen, his lunge half completed, his face a canvas of disbelief and horror, not at what he had done, but at what his brother had just admitted. Michael, the architect, had just confessed to the foundational crime, the one upon which all their other sins were built. He had pulled the keystone from their fortress, and now it was all collapsing in on them. Sarah Chen did not miss a beat. Her voice, cutting through the thick silence, was as sharp and cold as a scalpel. "Thank you for the clarification, Mr. Albright," she said to Michael. She then turned her gaze to both of them. It was the gaze of a hunter who has successfully caged two cornered, wounded animals. The terms of the agreement remain on the table. Sign. It was not a request. It was a command, a sentence. There was no fight left in them. All the arrogance, the bluster, the decades of untouchable power had evaporated in an instant. Jacob slumped back into his chair, a puppet with its strings cut, his face gray and slack. Michael was weeping now, not with the loud, performative grief he displayed at our mother's funeral, but with the silent, shoulder-shaking sobs of a man watching his own soul drain away onto the polished mahogany. Sarah pushed the signature pages in front of them. Michael, the lawyer who had built a career on the authority of his signature, could barely hold the pen. His hand trembled so violently that Sarah had to steady it for him. He signed his name, the letters a spidery, broken version of his once confident script. Then came Jacob. He stared at the page as if it were written in a language he could not comprehend. "Sign it, Jacob," Michael whispered, his voice a broken rasp. Jacob picked up the pen and scrawled his name, a mark of unconditional surrender. They signed away their homes, their businesses, their fortunes. They signed away their legacies. They signed away their lives. The aftermath was not a loud explosion that rocked Havenwood, but a quiet, swift, and total demolition. Sarah's team moved with the ruthless efficiency of a professional wrecking crew. Within a week, Michael's law firm was indefinitely closed. An anonymous tip to the State Bar Association, complete with a transcript of his confession to decades of financial malfeasance, triggered an immediate investigation and the suspension of his license. He was disbarred 3 months later. The man who was the pillar of the community retreated into the small rented house the trust allowed him to keep. He became a recluse, a ghost who was only seen on brief, furtive trips to the grocery store, his face shielded by a hat, his eyes fixed on the ground. Jacob's fall was more visible, and in some ways more pathetic. The trust took control of Albright Construction, immediately putting it into receivership and selling it for parts. His name was quietly chiseled off the hospital wing after the new management of the trust regretted to inform the board that Mr. Albright's pledged donations would no longer be forthcoming. His sprawling mansion on the hill was sold, its contents auctioned off. I saw him once, months later, coming out of a laundromat, his expensive clothes looking rumpled and ill-fitting on his now shrunken frame. He saw me, and for a second his eyes flashed with the old, familiar hatred, but it was a weak, dying ember. I felt nothing. Not pity, not triumph, nothing. He was just a bitter old man, a stranger who had once ruined my life. One afternoon, Sarah called me. "We have them, Emma," she said. "Michael's confession to the circumstances of your departure, and the adoption is on tape. It's enough. We can go to the district attorney. It's kidnapping, coercion, a dozen other things. They're old, but they would go to prison." I sat in the quiet of the old house on Elm Street, the house I now owned, and I considered it. I pictured my brothers, 2 broken old men in prison uniforms, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that it was not the justice I wanted. Prison was their world solution, a punishment of the body. But my entire war had not been about my body. It had been about my life, my name, my future. I was not interested in what the state could do to their bodies. I had already taken what they truly valued. "No," I said, my voice clear and steady. "We won't do that." "Are you sure?" Sarah asked, a note of surprise in her voice. "I'm sure," I replied. My justice was not about vengeance. It was about balance. For 60 years, their lives were built upon my silence and my poverty. Now my life will be built upon their silence and their poverty. The scales, after a lifetime, are finally balanced. Let them live out their days with that. My first act as a free and independent woman was to sell the house on Elm Street. I hired a company to come and empty it. I kept nothing but a few of my mother's books and my own childhood drawings. The rest, the heavy, dark furniture, the portraits of stern-faced ancestors, the crystal that had witnessed so many silent, agonizing dinners, it was all sold or given away. I wanted the Albright name and its ghosts exorcised from that place forever. The trust, of course, had been established with a single anonymous beneficiary, me's. The decades of stolen wealth, now liquidated and reclaimed, flowed silently into my accounts. I was, on paper, a woman of considerable means, but the money was not the point. The money was simply the tool, the key that had opened the door. Its true value was the freedom it represented. I didn't buy a mansion or a fancy car. I bought a small, sun-filled apartment in a town by the sea, a place where no one knew the Albright name. A place with no history, no ghosts. I submitted my letter of resignation to the Havenwood Library, thanking them for 42 years of employment. My life of quiet servitude was over. And so, my quiet reckoning concluded. It ended not with a bang, but with the peaceful, steady rhythm of waves on a shore. It ended with me, sitting in a comfortable armchair in my own clean, bright home, a place that was mine in a way nothing had ever been before. I was surrounded by books I had chosen, art that made me happy, and a profound, healing silence. The silence was no longer a weapon or a prison, it was simply peace. The war was over, the accounts were settled. I was 76 years old, and for the very first time in my life, I was free. The quiet I had purchased with my brother's ruin was a beautiful, expansive thing. It was the silence of a calm sea after a hurricane, the silence of a library after closing time. For the first time, my days were entirely my own, unburdened by the weight of a secret or the slow-burning fire of a 60-year-old plan. I filled them with simple pleasures, long walks by the ocean, the taste of good coffee, the weight of a new book in my hands. I had achieved a state of peace I had never thought possible. And yet, in the quietest moments, in the space between the notes of a classical piece on the radio or in the pre-dawn light, a ghost remained. Not the ghosts of my brothers or my parents who had been vanquished and exorcised, but a smaller, more persistent spirit, the ghost of an unnamed child, the echo of a single cry in a cold, sterile room. My reckoning with my family had been about justice, about balancing the scales of the past. But this ghost was not a matter of justice. It was an unfinished chapter, a question that had hovered, unanswered, for my entire adult life. Was she alive? Was she happy? Did she ever wonder about the mother who had signed her away? My freedom felt incomplete, my peace conditional. As long as this last, most important ghost remained unlaid. After months of enjoying my new life, I knew what my final task had to be. I called Sarah Chen. Her voice on the phone was warmer now, the sharp professional edge replaced by a genuine friendliness. "Emma," she said, "I was just thinking about you. I hope you're enjoying the sea air." "I am, Sarah, more than you know," I said, "but I have one last thing to ask of you. One final job." I explained what I needed. I spoke of the baby, the closed adoption, the blank space on the birth certificate where a father's name should have been. I asked her if it was possible, after all this time, to find her. Sarah was silent for a moment, and I knew she was recalling Michael's panicked confession in the conference room. "Emma," she said softly, "of course." "Consider it done." Her role, once again, shifted. She had been my legal warrior. Now, she became my compassionate private detective. The search was not like the financial investigation. That had been a hunt for crimes, a gathering of weapons. This was a search for a life. Armed with the location of the institution and the approximate date, and legally justified by Michael's taped confession of coercion and duress, Sarah petitioned the court in that distant state to unseal the adoption records. The walls of secrecy that had been insurmountable for a poor, powerless young woman crumbled easily before a wealthy, determined old one with a top-tier lawyer. The weeks I spent waiting for news were a unique and gentle form of torment. It was not the terror of my youth or the cold patience of my middle age. It was a fragile, anxious hope. I would sit on my balcony, watching the waves, and find myself lost in questions. Did she have my quiet nature, or the charisma of the man who was her father? Did she love books? What was her favorite color? Had life been kind to her? The questions were a swarm of butterflies in my chest, beautiful and unsettling all at once. I was bracing myself for any possibility that she had passed away, that her life had been difficult, or perhaps most painfully, that she was happy and complete and would want nothing to do with the woman who had given her away. The call from Sarah came on a Tuesday morning. "I found her, Emma," she said, her voice soft. I sat down, my hand gripping the arm of my chair. "Tell me." "Her name is Olivia," Sarah said. Her adoptive parents were wonderful people, a professor and a musician. They've both passed on now. Olivia is 59 years old. She lives in Oregon. She's a botanist, specializing in native orchids. Sarah paused. "She's married, Emma. 2 grown children, a boy and a girl. By all accounts, she's had a very good, very happy life." Sarah emailed me a photo she had found on the website of the university where Olivia worked. It was a picture of a woman with kind eyes, her hair a mix of brown and silver, standing in a greenhouse, smiling as she held a delicate, blooming orchid. I stared at the photo, my breath catching in my throat. I saw a hint of my own mother in her smile, the shape of her hands. A stranger, and yet, instantly, undeniably, a part of me. The ghost had a name. She had a face. She had a life filled with flowers and family. A wave of immense, profound relief washed over me, so powerful it left me weak. She was okay. She was happy. That was the most important thing. It was followed by a deep, aching grief for the 60 years I had missed, for the grandchildren I would never know, for the life of motherhood that had been stolen from me. Now came the most delicate question of all. What to do? I could get on a plane. I could go to Oregon, to her university, to her home. I could appear on her doorstep, a ghost from a past she didn't even know she had, and say, "I am your mother." But as I pictured the scene, a cold horror filled me. It was what my family would have done. It was an Albright move, selfish, entitled, demanding. To crash into her peaceful, well-ordered life, to detonate a bomb of 60-year-old trauma in her heart for the sake of my own emotional release, would be the final, most unforgivable violation. Her happiness was not mine to disrupt. I knew what I had to do. I would not use a telephone or an airplane. I would use the only medium that felt right, the medium of a librarian, a woman of words. I would write a letter. It took me 2 weeks to compose it. I sat at my desk, the sea breeze drifting through the open window, and I wrote and rewrote, the pages stained with tears I hadn't realized I was crying. I poured my entire life, my entire truth into that letter. "My dearest Olivia," I began, the name a miracle on my pen. "You do not know me, but 60 years ago, in a cold and lonely room, I gave you life. My name is Emma, and I am your biological mother. I am writing to you not to disrupt the beautiful life you have built, but to give you the one thing that was stolen from us both, the truth." I told her everything. I told her about Jacob's cruelty and Michael's betrayal, not to cast blame or seek pity, but to explain the impossible circumstances of her birth. I told her that she was conceived in violence, but that she, the innocent child, was never unwanted. "You were not a mistake," I wrote, my pen shaking. "You were a secret. You were not unloved. You were stolen from my arms before I ever had a chance to hold you. In the dark months before you were born, you were the only thing in my world that was real, a tiny, fierce life that I was desperate to protect, even though I did not know how." I told her of the decades of silence, of the long, slow plan for justice, and of the freedom I had finally found. I told her that finding out she was alive and happy was the final, greatest victory of my long war. And then, I wrote the most important part of all. "I am telling you all of this because you have a right to your own story, to know the roots from which you grew. I am not telling you this to ask for anything. I expect nothing in return. Your life is your own, and it is a life I have prayed for 60 years. If you choose to read this letter and throw it away and never think of it again, I will carry no bitterness. I will understand completely. All I ever wanted for you was a life of peace and happiness, and it brings me a joy you cannot imagine to know that you have found it." I sealed the letter with a final, selfless offering. "But if this letter brings questions, or if there is ever a time you wish to know more, I will be here, waiting. The choice is entirely and completely yours." The next morning, I walked to the small post office in town. I held the envelope in my hand. It was a lifetime folded into a few sheets of paper. It was my last secret, my last confession, my last act of love. I dropped it into the mailbox. The metallic clang echoed in the quiet air. I watched the mailman come later, empty the box, and drive away. I had sent my ghost out into the world not knowing if she would ever return. For the first time, the fortress inside my mind was truly empty. All the secrets, all the plans, all the pain, it was all gone, sent on a journey to Oregon. All that remained was a quiet, fragile, and terrifying hope. The days that followed the posting of the letter were lived in a new kind of silence. For 60 years, my silence had been a tool, a weapon, a shield, a prison. Now, for the first time, it was simply an empty space. It was the quiet of a stage after the final curtain has fallen, the actors have gone home, and all that remains is a vast, expectant stillness. I had sent my last secret, my final truth, out into the world, and I had no idea if it would ever return. I did not spend those days pacing or anxiously waiting by the phone. I had spent a lifetime waiting, and I was done with it. Instead, I lived. I walked for miles along the beach, feeling the cool sand under my feet and the salt spray on my face. I filled my small, sunny apartment with plants, my hands finding a simple, grounding pleasure in the soil. I read all the books I had never had the peace of mind to truly absorb. I was living in the freedom I had fought for, and I was determined not to let it be held hostage by a single, hoped-for phone call. My peace could no longer be conditional. It had been bought at too high a price. And yet, hope is a persistent, insidious thing. Every time the mail was delivered, my heart would give a small, traitorous leap. Every time the phone rang, a jolt of adrenaline would course through me before I answered to find a polite telemarketer on the other end. I was at peace, but I was also on a quiet, humming alert, a coastal town waiting to see if a ship, long lost at sea, would finally appear on the horizon. One afternoon, I sat in my favorite armchair, a cup of tea growing cool beside me, looking out at the endless expanse of the ocean. My journey felt both a lifetime long and like a story that had happened to someone else. I thought of my brothers, two withered old men living out their days in the quiet ruin of their own making. I no longer felt hatred for them, only a distant clinical pity for the smallness of their souls, for the greed that had cost them everything. I thought of the house on Elm Street, now just a property with new owners, its power over me dissolved, its ghosts finally laid to rest. I had won. It was a strange, quiet victory, one with no parades or celebrations. I had not defeated my enemies in a blaze of glory. I had simply outlasted them. I had been more patient. I had understood the nature of my own power better than they had ever understood the nature of theirs. For 60 years, silence was my prison. It was the cudgel my family used to keep me in my place, the suffocating blanket they threw over the truth. But in the end, it was also my weapon. In my silence, I observed. In my silence, I remembered. In my silence, I planned. I did not need screams or vengeance to win my war. I did not need to match their violence or their rage. I just needed to wait for the echoes of their actions to finally fade, leaving only the cold, hard truth behind. On the small table beside my chair sat the photograph Sarah had sent me, Olivia, my daughter. A botanist with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair, smiling in a greenhouse a continent away. I looked at her face every day, not with the grief of what was lost, but with the quiet wonder of what had been created, a beautiful life that had flourished in spite of the poison from which it had sprung. The phone rang. The sound was sharp and clear, cutting through the peaceful afternoon quiet. It was not a local number. I looked at the small screen. It showed a series of numbers, and beneath them, the words I had been both dreading and longing to see. Portland, Oregon. My heart did not leap. It simply stopped for a beat, and then began to pound, a slow, heavy, powerful rhythm against my ribs, my breath caught in my throat. This was it. The ship was on the horizon. I looked from the ringing phone to the photograph of the smiling woman. I thought of the 60 years of silence, of the final, fragile hope sent in a single white envelope. A smile touched my lips. It was not a smile of triumph or of relief. It was a small, uncertain, and deeply hopeful thing, a flower pushing its way through the frozen earth after a long and bitter winter. The phone rang for a third time. I reached for it, my hand steady. The long wait was over. My quiet reckoning was complete. All that was left was to say hello.